Picture a little girl. She's tucked into bed, her mother's voice soft in the dim light, reading her a story about a princess locked in a tower. The girl smiles. She drifts to sleep feeling safe, feeling comforted. She has no idea that the story her mother just told her, the one about the princess, the prince, the happily ever after, was originally written to describe something so dark, so brutal, that if she ever read the real version, she would never sleep again. That's not an exaggeration. That's history. Here's what nobody tells you. Fairy tales, the ones you grew up with, the ones Disney turned into billion-dollar franchises, the ones printed in pastel colors with smiling characters on the cover, they were never written for children, not even close. They were written for adults living in a world so terrifying, so full of death, disease, and powerlessness that they needed stories to process it all. And when those stories got sanitized, cleaned up, softened for little ears, something essential was lost. Something that changes the way you understand every bedtime story you've ever heard. To understand how deep this goes, you have to go back. Not to the Disney studios, not to the Victorian parlor. You have to go back to medieval Europe. Imagine living in a village in 1300s Germany. There is no hospital within reach. There is no police force. Famine comes every few years and takes entire families. Children die at alarming rates. Not one in a family, sometimes all of them. Wolves actually roamed the forests. Strangers actually kidnapped children. Witches weren't fantasy. They were the old women on the outskirts of town that people genuinely feared and sometimes burned. Life was fragile, random, and cruel, and in that world, parents needed a way to talk to their children about danger, not in a gentle, cushioned, age-appropriate way, in a way that actually kept them alive. So they told stories, and those stories were warnings. This is where the Brothers Grimm enter the picture. And the story of how we got here is stranger than anything they ever wrote. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were German academics in the early 1800s. They weren't trying to entertain children, they were trying to preserve culture. They traveled through the German countryside, collecting oral folk tales that had been passed down for generations. Stories told around fires, in market squares, whispered by grandmothers to keep children from wandering too far into the dark. The Grimm brothers wrote these stories down, and what they found was not magic, it was horror. Take Cinderella, you know the version, the glass slipper, the pumpkin carriage, the prince. But in the original Grimm version, the one collected from actual oral tradition, the stepsisters don't just fail to fit into the slipper, they cut off their own toes and heels to force their feet inside. They bleed through the shoe. A bird reveals their deception, and at the end of the story, as punishment, those same birds peck out the stepsisters' eyes, leaving them blind, broken, stumbling in darkness for the rest of their lives. That's how the story ends. Not with a dance, with mutilation. Or take Little Red Riding Hood. Charles Perrault, the French author who first wrote it down in 1697, didn't give the story a rescue. There was no huntsman, no last-minute save. The wolf eats the grandmother, then the wolf eats the girl. And the story ends there. The moral, written explicitly by Perrault himself, was a warning to young women, specifically about men who appear charming and gentle, but have darker intentions. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a survival manual. Perrault was telling girls in language they'd remember, trust the wrong person, and there is no one coming to save you. And then there's Sleeping Beauty. In the version most people think they know, a princess falls asleep, a prince kisses her, she wakes up, they live happily ever after. But the original tale, collected across multiple European traditions, including one by Giambattista Basile in 1634, tells a different story entirely. In that version, the sleeping girl isn't woken by a kiss. She's found by a king who is already married. He assaults her while she sleeps. She doesn't wake up until, months later, one of the twins she gives birth to, while unconscious, accidentally suckles the splinter from her finger. She wakes up. She has children she didn't know she was carrying, and the king's wife, furious, tries to cook and serve the children to the king as punishment. That is the original Sleeping Beauty. There is no Disney song for that. Here's what starts to become clear the deeper you go. These stories weren't being cruel for cruelty's sake. They were being honest. In a world where children could be sold, stolen, starved, or killed, and regularly were, the adults who told these stories were trying to give children the only armor they had: fear, caution, awareness, the understanding that the world did not love them, and that survival required them to be smart, suspicious, and never, ever naive. But something happened. The world changed, slowly, then all at once. By the 1800s, the concept of childhood was shifting. In earlier centuries, children were essentially small adults, expected to work, contribute, and understand the full weight of the world from as early as possible. But the Victorian era brought a new idea that children deserved innocence, that they should be protected from the darkness of the adult world, that stories told to children should be gentle, uplifting, morally simple. And so the editing began. The Brothers Grimm themselves did it. In the first edition of their collection, published in 1812, the stories were raw. By the seventh edition, in 1857, they had softened dozens of tales, removing sexual content, toning down violence, adding redemptive endings that weren't in the originals. They were responding to market pressure, to changing social norms, to the rising middle class that wanted bedtime stories that felt safe. And with every edit, the original purpose of the stories slipped further away. Then came Disney, and if the Grimm brothers trimmed the edges, Disney rebuilt the entire structure from the ground up. Snow White in 1937, Cinderella in 1950, Sleeping Beauty in 1959. Each one took a story soaked in warning, complexity, and darkness, and replaced it with music, romance, and the comforting promise that good things happen to good people. Which is, if you think about it, almost the exact opposite of what the original stories were teaching. And here's where it gets genuinely unsettling, not just historically, but personally. Because there's a question hiding inside all of this that most people never think to ask. What did we lose when we sanitized the stories? What happened to the generation of children raised on the cleaned up versions, the versions where every danger has a rescue, every villain is defeated, every ending is happy? Did we make children safer by protecting them from dark stories, or did we make them less equipped to handle a world that is, undeniably, not always going to give them a happy ending? Bruno Bettelheim, one of the most influential child psychologists of the 20th century, wrote an entire book on this question in 1976. It was called The Uses of Enchantment, and his argument was stark. The original, dark, violent fairy tales were psychologically necessary for children, because children's inner worlds are not pastel-colored. Children feel rage, they feel jealousy, fear, abandonment, powerlessness. They have dark thoughts they don't have words for. And the old fairy tales, with their wicked stepmothers, their child-eating witches, their forests full of genuine danger, gave children a safe container to experience and process those feelings. When you sanitize the stories, Bettelheim argued, you don't protect children. You leave them alone with feelings they now have no language for. Think about what that means for a moment. We replaced stories that said, danger is real and you must be wise and brave to survive it, with stories that said, wait for your prince, be beautiful and kind, and everything will work out. We replaced complexity with comfort, and then we were surprised when people grew up unable to handle complexity, unable to sit with discomfort, looking for a rescue that isn't coming. The turning point isn't just historical, it's personal, because every one of us was handed a version of the story. You were told in 100 different ways that if you were good enough, patient enough, pretty enough, pure enough, something would come along and save you. That's the core lie of the sanitized fairy tale, and it is a lie that has shaped, quietly and profoundly, the way millions of people relate to hardship, to failure, to the absence of a happy ending. The original tales knew something that we've tried very hard to forget, that the forest is real, that the wolf exists, that not every ending is redemption, and that the most important survival skill isn't waiting to be rescued. It's being the kind of person who knows how to find their way out of the dark. And maybe that's the deeper reason these stories survived for so long before we changed them. Not because they were entertaining, not because they were beautiful, but because they were true. They reflected the actual texture of human experience, the randomness of suffering, the existence of real evil, the weight of choices made in fear or desperation. They told people, you are not safe, but you can be smart. You are not guaranteed anything, but you can survive. That message, stripped of its darkness, loses its power entirely. We are living through a moment right now where the sanitized version of reality is everywhere. Social media gives us filtered faces and curated lives. Algorithms serve us content that confirms what we already believe. We are surrounded constantly by the modern equivalent of the cleaned-up fairy tale, the version that makes us feel good, that removes the sharp edges, that promises a happy ending if we just keep watching, Keep scrolling, keep consuming. And just like the children raised on Disney instead of Grimm, we are less and less equipped to handle the moments when reality doesn't cooperate, when the wolf is real, when there's no huntsman, when the slipper doesn't fit and no one is coming with a carriage. The dark truth behind fairy tales isn't just a piece of history, it's a mirror. And what it reflects, if you're willing to look, is a question about what we owe each other, and especially what we owe children. Do we owe them comfort, or do we owe them the truth? Do we protect them by hiding the forest, or do we protect them by teaching them what lives inside it? The oldest storytellers believed in the second option. They wrapped the truth in magic and metaphor, made it beautiful and strange and frightening. But they never looked away from it. And perhaps that is the greatest thing we lost when we handed the stories to a corporation and let them sand down every edge until all that remained was the glitter and the song. We lost the belief that people, even small people, even young people, are strong enough to hear the truth, and that stories at their best are not an escape from the world. They are preparation for it. If this video made you see something differently, made you think about a story you thought you knew, share it with someone who needs to hear it. This is Dark Sphere. We don't tell you the comfortable version. We tell you what's real. Subscribe, because the next story goes even deeper.